So what is baking? Baking is the process of writing 3D information of a detailed mesh onto another mesh using pixels, so using texture in our case. So our goal here is to create a normal map, an AO map, and a curvature map. I won't be using displacement map in this tutorial. This is something I've shown in the Shield tutorial, which is available for free on my YouTube channel and my Gumroad page. What we have here is a high poly mesh, which was called using dynamic topology, and my low poly target mesh. The first thing we have to do is make sure those two are aligned. So I will press Alt G to move my base mesh onto the sculpted one. Then I will select first the high poly mesh, then the low poly one. Now I need to create a material for the low poly mesh so that Blender can find a target to write the texture on. So I've created a new material. I will press Ctrl T and open my Baker map here. So now I have this as a target. I will go into the render option. So regarding normal map, we don't care about the sample. So I can put it to 2 in the render option because it's not a ray tracing option. I will let those information by default for the time being and get rid of all of this. I will uncheck cage and set this to 0.01, which is the default value, I believe. And I will bake the normal in tangent space. Clear will clear all informations here, so that's a pretty important thing to know, and we will be using it. So I will click bake now and see the result. So we can see that I have here a baked normal map, which is very buggy whenever you get those greenish pixels here. That means that Blender has inversed the normals, which is not good. And also, when I zoom in here, you can see that I have those gradient color, meaning that there is information that has been written, but here it's pure bluish purple, which means it didn't write the information. And this is because when Blender projects the base mesh onto the high poly mesh, it uses the normals information. So currently it is projecting the normals of our base mesh here on inward toward the inside. So whatever part of the sculpted mesh is not under our low poly mesh won't be written. So what I do to fix this, there is 2 ways. The first one is to use a cage. So this will be a secondary mesh, which is here, which is currently a duplication of our original low poly mesh, because you needed to have the exact same number of vertices and the same topology, and it's bigger than here the high poly mesh, which is lying under. So the benefit of a cage is that when you edit it, you can really move each point one by one to be covering the whole high poly mesh with great accuracy. But this means that we will have a lot more work to be done on all our armor pieces to get to this result. But if I will make a new baking using this method, so I select first the high poly mesh, then the low poly. I will use cage here and select my shield cage and bake again. So now we can see that I got a way better normal map here, which is written everywhere, but it's at the cost of working a lot on creating the cage. So we can outpass this by giving Blender a distance information. And you can see it's called extrusion, because Blender will extrude or inflate our base mesh in the distance we're setting here. So I have a little trick to guess which distance has to be done, is that in edit mode here, I set in the mesh display the normals. And we have those bluish edges pointing toward the normals, and the distance here we are giving them to the size. So by default it's at 0.01, and I can see in some area like this I can't see those blue edges, and this is because they are under the sculpted model. So what I do is that I just increase slightly, so it was at 0.06, and now I can see all of them even on this little part here. So I believe this distance in Blender unit will be the right value. So instead of using the cage, I will set here the distance to 0.06, and I will bake again, and we should get some nice result. It will be a little less accurate than using the cage, but in our case that will make us save a lot of time, and then we'll be able to fix the little baking issues using some painting, which is very easy. So now you can see with this distance I don't have any holes in my normals, and it looks quite good. So there are still some little trouble here, but generally speaking it looks good. So this is what we will be applying to our model, this method, to bake everything. Now let's have a rapid overview of the different options we have here. The margin option here, if I go into edit mode on my low poly mesh, you can see that I have my UVs here, and I have those bleeding edges, meaning that Blender has extrapolated the latest written pixel with more or less accuracy, and has duplicated it on 12 pixels outward. This is to avoid seams on the border of our object. Then we have this clear option, meaning that every time I will press baking, Blender will erase everything on our target picture here, which is here, and rewrite the normals. In the case of our armor, we will be writing multiple objects on the same picture. So we'll use it for the very first baking, but then make sure you uncheck this. Also, whenever you write those information, I think Blender will notice you that the baking map is saved to internal image, save it externally, or pack it, meaning that it's just in the buffer of Blender. And whenever you will restart your file, you will lose this. So you may click image, save image, or save as image if you haven't done this before. Then baking use the rendering option, so it uses the sampling here, and it writes the information onto the map you have created. So you can see its resolution here. So it's not based on the dimension of your document. But Blender will be using all the sampling option. As we will be baking normals, we can set it to 2. For the curvature map, we'll be using an emission shader, which doesn't need any samples to be accurate, so we'll set it to 2 also. But for the ambient occlusion, this will be ray traced, so we'll need to crank up a bit the samples, maybe to 300 or 400. Then you can use, as usual, your usual performance. So I'm using a GPU with those value for the tiles, and that's it. So here we can see all the options. You can bake absolutely everything, but we'll be focusing on the ambient occlusion, normals, and also the combine, because we will trick a little shader to do so. So that's it. I can get rid of the cage here. We won't be using it, but we'll be guessing the ray distance using the same method. So let's dive into baking our information on the shield first. I will first move my different objects on different layers, putting all the sculpted parts on one layer and then moving the different other parts on different layers, one for the armor, one for the leather, etc. I will then select my low poly shield, rename the shader we have created Baker, and create a new map. I will be using 4K map for the weapons, so I will call this weapon Baker, and I will save it, pressing F3 into a map folder. Now I can isolate both the low poly and the high poly mesh and enable the normals to calculate the distance. So here we can see it's way too big. At 0.01 it's also too big, so I will try a lower number so we can't see it right now. But it seems that the value of 0.003 will be our good to go. I can now go into the node editor, get rid of those because Blender will use the UVs by default, and load our Baker map. Now I get back to the 3D view, I make sure that my high poly mesh is selected and my low poly is active, and I will set my baking option. So first the sampling, 5 will be enough as I told you before, and then I will go to bake, select normals, keep checked the clear, a margin of 16 should be okay. I will get rid of the simplify option in the send settings, click select to active, enter our value which was 0.003. Exit edit mode and then click bake. So I have a lot of bugs going on, and this is because our ray distance was too low, so I will crank up it a little bit to 0.005 and I will bake again. Now my normal maps look way better. There are still some little bugs, those greenish area, but I know this is where the leather parts are attached, and these are very complicated areas that are partially occluded, so this may explain those problems. So I will give it a go for this ray distance and this nice normal map. So now I can bake the sword, and I've made sure that I have unchecked clear before I launch the baking so that Blender doesn't erase what we have written before. I first select our high poly sword, then the low poly one, and click bake. Also note I have modified the ray distance to 0.007 to bake the sword and probably the shield. I may have missed it into the recording. Seems I got a decent result, even if I have some trouble in occluded areas. And now I'm just double checking that the margin here is correct and the pixels are not bleeding on each UV island. Now just don't forget to save your image, going into image, save image. And now opening a new 3D view in texture mode, I can check if my normals looks good, which seems to be. I will rapidly test my normal map, so I will go into the node editor, select the world options, click use nodes, then press Ctrl T using the node wrangler. I will load one of the HDRs that are free in this course. I can now launch rendering mode by pressing Shift Z, select object to be edited in the node editor, switch to non-color data whenever you're using a normal map or a map that doesn't involve color information, and I will plug this normal map into a glossy shader with a very low roughness, so that I will get sharp reflection, and that will be easy for me to identify whether my normal map is working nicely. I can now see the effect of my normal map on my low poly mesh. So as it's not that obvious here, I will rotate the HDR so that the sky is pointing a little bit onto the y-axis, so that it will give more reflection to my object. Because here on this sparking HDR, there is a lot of the ground reflecting onto our model, and that's quite hard to guess. In the node editor, I can switch back to world option, and I will rotate the map around the x-axis and see if I have a better result. It seems to look good. We have some wavy pattern due to the limitation of our resolution, but as it will be mixed with all color information, we won't be seeing it on the final model. So for me, that's fine this way.